for how to create an object or an item in the environment that the player character can then interact with and essentially gather, that can be used for part of progress in a quest. So we have our quest open the garage, and if you remember, we set up an entry state for it, find a way into the garage. And so what I'm gonna do is create a key that I can hide over here or something. Maybe I had this idea of having a dead guard, and when the player goes over and sees the dead guard, maybe they can search his body and find the keys. But for now, we're just gonna kind of set up the prototype of this, and I'm just gonna make a quick and dirty 3D object cube, which we can use as a stand-in placeholder for the key. Eventually it'll actually probably be the guard's body or something with maybe some visual effects to help it read as interactable. But for now, we're going to just set up the prototype using this cube, and our player character is set up with various components of the dialogue system so that we can add usable components. So if we find the NPC game object that we added to our NPCs, it has a usable component on there somewhere. There it is. So if we put a usable component on anything, the way our player character is set up, it should allow our system to interact with that thing. So I'm going to add a usable component, which is part of dialogue system, and I'll just hit play, and you can see right away what it does. So I walk up to it and it says cube, spacebar, interact. You can customize what it says there with this override text field, and then if you wanted, you could set up events to handle what happens when the player uses the thing. But what we're gonna do is add a dialogue system trigger that will trigger on use, which is connected to this. So whenever the player presses spacebar, this dialogue system trigger will get fired off and do whatever it says. And so that is handled by these actions. So I'm going to expand actions, and let's add an action. And I guess it's what do we really want to have happen at that point? Well, I want to make it seem like the player got an item, and then this thing, I guess, could disappear. And it may seem intuitive to go to the thing that says quest/items in the dialogue editor here and add an item, but I don't think that's the easiest way to do this. I think, to give you an idea of how this would work, if you wanted to use items in this context, it would be for if you had maybe an inventory menu system, and then every item could have its own description, and then maybe even if you click on it, you can see inside of all fields there's even pictures you could add. So every inventory item has an icon and an item description. And the thing that's kind of missing here, in my opinion, is a count. How many of these items do you have? And you could actually set that up if you go into templates and you find the template for item, which kind of defines that data structure. Every item has all of these things: a name, pictures, description. This thing that says is item set to true, which I don't know really why that's necessary, but then we would probably want to add an additional property called count or something like that, which would be a number. I don't know what I just did there. I'm confused. Here's the new one I added. Alright, this is the new thing I added. I really don't know what that is. Anyway, I hit plus and it added this thing at the very bottom. I would change this to a number, and I would call it count, and you would set the default to 0. That's what I would do if I was going to have a game where we had an inventory menu. Well, we're not going to set all that up. We don't have time for that in this exercise. So instead, what I'm going to do is use a variable. And a variable can just track, either how many of the item they've collected, if it's something they can get more than one of. And this is covered in the Pixel Crushers tutorial pretty well. There's a video tutorial called Quests. You can check it out, and they show how to set up a variable for something like collecting babies or something silly like that. In our example, we're going to make a new variable. So you hit the plus button, and we're going to make it a Boolean, which is basically a true or false property. And I'm going to call it, normally you want to name your Boolean variables as like yes or no questions, and this one's going to be called has key. So it's like, it's clear just by reading it, do I have the key, yes or no, true or false. All right, so I've got my variable set up, and then back here on my cube where I have the dialog system trigger, I'm going to add an action for what happens when it gets used. So I'm going to click add action, and I'm going to choose run Lua code, and I'm going to use that same wizard we've been messing with from the conversation editor, and this time I'm going to hit the plus button, and I want to set a variable, and it's already got has key as the default here, and actually I wanted to set it to true. So when you interact with the cube or use the cube, it's going to set this variable to true. So I'll hit apply, and it actually adds that code. Alright, so the next step, like, you can see that this is working, I guess, if you use the watches debug system here. I ran the game, I hit escape to get my cursor, I went and clicked on watches in the dialog window here, and I'm going to add a watch, which you can do from this menu drop down, and actually I'm going to choose add a runtime variable, and it'll give me a list of the options. These are the variables in my game so far. I'm going to choose has key, and if I hit refresh, it'll tell me the value of has key, and you can see it's setting itself as false to begin with, just because that's the initial value we set up here. And in theory, then if I go up to the cube and I interact with it, and then I go over here and I hit refresh, you can see that the value has updated to true. So I can tell it's working. The player doesn't have a lot of good feedback that this has done anything. One thing we can do is, like, if it's meant to be an object you're collecting, it makes sense that that object is removed from the scene. There's different ways you can set that up, but I think we can do it just using our existing dialog system trigger. So what I'm going to do is add another action here, and this time we will choose set an object as active or inactive. And so, like, just to give you an example, like between this one and then this next one, set components enabled or disabled. So setting a game object active or inactive is essentially just like checking this checkbox. So if I set it as inactive, it's like unchecking it, which basically makes it disappear. It's gone. So that is a good way to make it visually leave the scene. But if I just wanted to, like, say, make it no longer usable, I could just disable an individual component on this game object. So if that's what I wanted to do, if I wanted to leave the model in the scene but just make it no longer usable, I would add an action where we set a component to enabled or disabled, and I would disable this component. But if it's something I'm collecting out of the scene, we'll just use set game objects active or inactive, and we have to hit, like, it gives us this list of things. So you could turn off lots of different things or turn on and off a variety of things. So right now it has list is empty, so you have to hit plus. And now we have to tell it which game object we want to change the state of. And in this case, it's going to be this cube, which really I should probably rename to key. So maybe before I get confused, let's just go ahead and rename that game object to key, and you can see it changed its name there too. And if you missed it, you just drag that in there. There's another way to do it. If you have a ton of objects in your hierarchy and it's hard to find it in the hierarchy, you could click this button, and you just want to make sure that you're looking in the scene. Don't click assets. That'll show like every asset in your game. You want to just look at what's in the actual scene, and we could start typing in by name to find it and get it in there that way too. And we don't want to set it to true, because that's essentially like checking this box. We want to uncheck the box to make it look like it's leaving the scene. So we're going to set its state to false. Or look, this is kind of neat. You could flip it and make it whatever it isn't. But we want to definitely set it to false here. Now that we've made that setup, let's go ahead and test it again. And so I'm going to interact with the cube, and it went away. And then let's just double check this still worked now that we turned off the object that it was on. And it's still getting set to true, so that's good.